Um, Welcome everyone to the 7th webinar of our successful initiative 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic, jointly promoted by City Space Architecture and the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This initiative is curated by myself, Luisa and Hendrik Tieben from the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Space, which is the web platform that is hosting this initiative and that is connecting all these amazing speakers that we are inviting for all our webinars. Thank you for joining and thank you for your interest in our initiative. We have today from the Chinese University of Hong Kong also Yin-Fen Chen that will moderate the Q&A session with the audience, and Stephanie Cheung that will write a summary that we will later publish on the Journal of Public Space website so that you can follow up later both with the recorded video of this webinar and the summary, and potentially also we try to include as much as possible reading materials or websites where you can read additional information that will be discussed today during this webinar. So we are here today for this, I would say, very exciting topic, creating accessible and inclusive public spaces with and for resilient communities. We have an amazing panel of speakers from Canada, United States, Taiwan, Brazil, Australia, Lebanon, and United Kingdom. We will have presentations from all these speakers, and then later we will have a commentary and roundtable discussion. Since our agenda is very full, I will just start with the presentations from the speakers. I will just give a brief introduction to each speaker so that you have an idea of the perspective and expertise that each speaker is bringing to the discussion. You can read full CVs that we published on the webpage of this seminar on the Journal of Public Space website. Maybe Fen, you can, or Stephanie, you can share in the chat the webpage of the seminar where you can read all CVs of different speakers. For attendees, please, if you have any questions, you can write your questions in the Q&A because I think we have disabled the chat probably for attendees, so you can just talk with us by using the Q&A option. Okay, so we start with, as I said, we have this amazing panel of speakers, and so we start with perspectives and statements, I would say, from Hannes Lagrelius from World Blind Union and Katherine Kline and Shu-Ti. Hannes is program officer at the World Blind Union, a federation representing the estimated 253 million persons who are blind and partially sighted worldwide, with over 190 national member organizations. Hannes is a very young advocate for inclusive and accessible cities. He managed World Blind Union's global program for inclusive and accessible cities, aiming to promote and ensure that urban development policies and practices integrate disability inclusion, accessibility, and universal design to leave no one behind in urban transformation. Okay, so I will share Hannes' presentation by using my screen. Hannes?
Yeah, great. Yes, can everyone hear me?
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen. It's not the first page though.
Yeah. Sorry. Going back to the first page. Yes, and we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, excellent. Great. So good afternoon and evening and also morning to everyone. First, of course, I need to extend my appreciation for the hosts of the webinar, and it's really been an interesting series, and the World Ban Uni is super happy to take part of this one and contribute, and also to engage in discussions with a great set of speakers today. So if we swiftly move over to next page, I will talk a little bit about the perspective on inclusive and accessible public space from a disability perspective. And first, we need to remember that it's estimated that today, around 15% of the global population have some experience of a disability. And also recall that disability is a result of societal barriers to persons with different functionalities. The majority of persons with disabilities today live in a low-income context, and that disability just needs to be seen from both as a cause and a consequence of poverty. We can also mention that, as we all know, urbanization is rapidly increasing. And by 2050, around 1 billion persons with disabilities will reside in cities. The number is around 50% today. Meanwhile, this increase of urban residents with disabilities, the aging population is also rapidly increasing. And this puts a pressure on cities to really adapt their strategies and practices so that spaces and services will be usable by all. And next page, please. So going back to the core references when it comes to, in our understanding at least, disability inclusion and accessibility from a global framework approach. Our core reference is, as always, in our work around disability rights, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which do not only have accessibility as cross-cutting, but also in specific articles. The 2030 agenda is very clear on disability inclusion, and many of the SDGs will not be reached without guaranteeing and ensuring universal accessibility to service spaces, products, etc. And it also has a sort of universal accessibility approach in many of the goals, not least SDG 11. Then not to mention also the Sendai framework, which puts emphasis on universal design to be incorporated for long-term resilience. And of course, on urban development, the new urban agenda, which is also specifically highlighting the needs and rights of persons with disabilities, accessibility, and universal design. And all of these frameworks are and instruments are mutually reinforcing, while as the convention in the UN is the only legally binding, the others are political commitments. Next page, please. So when it comes to legal aspects and standards, when it comes to universal accessibility generally from a disability rights perspective, as I mentioned, accessibility is cross-cutting in the UN Convention, and accessibility includes features that increase use of access and breaking barriers to the physical, social, and digital spaces. Because often when we talk about accessibility, a very common mistake is that then only the physical aspects, such as installing a ramp, will solve all the accessibility shortcomings in your public space. And the convention comes with legal obligations for states, parties, that products and services and spaces which are provided to the public are accessible. When it comes to standard and legislation to universal accessibility, and specifically as defined in the UNCRPD, international accessibility standards exist for the usability of the built environment and accessibility, but also within certain countries' anti-discrimination legislations and local standards. Next page, please. So the imperatives, I was reviewing this yesterday, and the imperatives for universal accessibility from our approach would be that building a universally accessible public space certainly benefits everyone throughout their life course, not only persons with disabilities or temporary mobility limitations. And that public space, which actually is usable by all, is the true medium for social inclusive cities. And that the public spaces which works for all provides a space to break cycles of stigmatization and negative attitudes, often facing, for instance, persons with disabilities, and enables interaction and participation of diverse groups, not only as active participants, but also in shaping our surrounding communities. And that it creates safety, for example, for youth to shape their social identities when they are young, and for women who face mutually reinforcing discrimination. But we need to remember that public space, in our opinion, is a critical link when it comes to the mobility chain in everyday life. And therefore, we always view accessibility from throughout the day. For example, you leave your house, you go into public space, you go to work. How is that chain creating a barrier-free environment, and what obstacles exist? And lastly, it improves resilience, safety, for example, for evacuation, but also access to information on equal grounds as others. Next page, please. So in order to address many of the shortcomings of inaccessible public spaces today, we feel that it's necessary that planners and practitioners and designers really make efforts to adopt the universal design approach, because this recognizes that there is a wide spectrum of human abilities, as everyone passes through childhood, periods of temporary illness, injury, and some at least 50% and more of pregnancy and old age. And by designing for human diversity, spaces and things are created that are accessible and usable by everyone. And this will not need any adaptations or specialized design in the same extent. Next slide, please. So by designing right from the start is something we have worked on in our policy development oriented work. And by considering accessibility and universal design from the start of any project, lessen the risk of retrofitting. Because as we noted from the second slide, populations which is today seen as specialized solutions will not be economically feasible in the long term as these populations increase and the needs as much. But by taking this already from the start into consideration, it has to be viewed from a perspective of, okay, we maybe did not make the best investment, so we had to retrofit and rebuild later on. But this is terribly unsmart, in my opinion, because retrofitting environments will increase the total costs by up to 20% of a project budget. And if universal design accessibility were addressed at the outset of this project in the design phase, it will only be around 1% to 3% more expensive. But retrofitting and also add-on features later on to a space can also lead to disruption, the general usability and appeal, and also exclude certain groups, because that will be ad hoc solutions, which maybe is usable to some, but not to others. And also by retrofitting, it will demand quite a lot of resources of the city management. And it will also cause and potentially cause negative environmental footprints, not analyzed from the start. Next slide, please. So some challenges, and I know the time is short today, but as we view it, inaccessible public spaces hinders persons with disabilities to enjoy the public spaces and break the cycle of stigmatization and exclusion if we are not able to use that space and interact with our fellow residents. And accessibility cannot really be addressed if you don't have analyzed the availability of the public space, especially since we see that public spaces are shrinking, and also that there is increased competition between public and private interest in the public spaces, and also the presence of contradictory legal policies to uphold different human rights. There is a challenge in that there is an insufficient integration of your universal design in planning and practices. But as I mentioned before, only addressing some specific accessibility component, for example, for a person with physical accessibility, can increase the challenges faced by others, for example, myself, who are partially sighted. And the challenge is also that general assumptions exist that planners and designers per default understand and address universal accessibility, and that complying just with standards will not really trigger change, and that there is a lack of participatory planning and processes with persons with disabilities and other groups in the localities. And lastly, that when we view the public space and the universal access of public space from a global perspective, it's recognized very clearly in SDG 11, but when you go into the indicators, the accessibility component is not measured, and it can result it can actually divert the discourse on how universal accessibility is seen. Next page, please. So very, very, very quickly on our programming on the side of the World Blind Union, we started with a more comprehensive programming around urban development in 2019. And in January, we entered a milestone agreement with UN Habitat to really support UN Habitat to advance on disability inclusion, universal design, and accessibility in normative and practical work. We work around knowledge production, for example, an ongoing project with an organizational accessibility guide for any types of organization, because we know that working with inclusion and accessibility, it starts with organizational practices, because otherwise we'll not be able to deliver inclusive impact. Policy development is one part of our work, being part of the global conversations trickled down to local levels and to mobilize persons with disabilities and their representative organizations at different levels. Engaging in relevant global networks towards cities for all, comprised of many different types of stakeholders and actors needed to move forward. And last but not least, also a result of where we are and why I am here today, is that we, during WOOF 11, announced a collaboration with CitySpace Architecture to co-create a special edition of the Journal on Public Space on universal design public spaces ahead of WOOF 11 in 2022. Yeah, I see that the year there is wrong. Sorry for that. Next page, please. Yep, so I'd like to thank you all for listening in. I'm looking forward for the other presentations and discussions. And just three very quick points to remember: that integrating accessibility universal design at outset is smart, cost-effective, more environmental friendly, and promotes well-being. And addressing accessibility barriers in all their different forms benefits everyone through their life course. And that fully accessible and inclusive spaces cannot be achieved without the active engagement of persons with disabilities and other diverse groups in planning and design. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannes, for your presentation that I think frames very well, you know, the discussion around accessibility and disabilities, and also the efforts that World Blind Union has taken across decades, I guess, but recently through UN Habitat in order to advise regarding designing accessible and inclusive public spaces. So now we move to Katherine, Kline and Shu-Ti. They will talk about accessibility and universal design from another perspective, from older persons. Katherine is co-chair of the General Assembly of Partners, Older Persons Partner Constituent Group, a civil society coalition working with UN Habitat to ensure the inclusion of aging and older people in the new urban agenda. She is a very strong activist and she's very passionate about this topic. Her presentation will be in collaboration with Shu-Ti from Taiwan. She is a doctor and has a PhD in epidemiology. She's also the founder and president of the Health and Sustainable Development Foundation, and she has an amazing number of brilliant achievements both at the professional and academic level. I don't want to take your time for your presentation. Okay, so now I'm sharing again the screen for Katie.
Thank you very much, Luisa. I'm going to jump in because I only have 3.5 minutes since my colleague and I are sharing our 7 minutes. So first, I want to thank both of you and your organizations for inviting us. I think it's very important to address the issue of inclusivity. As my colleague Hannes said, we work very well and often together collaboratively. It's estimated by the United Nations that approximately 46% of the increasing older population, defined by the United Nations as 60 years and older, will at some point have a disability. So we definitely collaborate in both our population and our work. What do we know about public space, research on older persons in public space? And the truth is, in talking to my research colleagues, there's very little that we know. I mean, Hannes has mentioned how important public space is to reducing social isolation. Many older persons nowadays in cities either live alone or may not speak the local language if they've moved from another place, perhaps to help out their children and grandchildren. And public space is the one vehicle where they can interact not only with people their age, but also with every age. And we're stressing how important it is to take an intergenerational cross-age perspective. We know that the world is aging. Hannes gave you some figures on disability. Habitat 3 identified global aging as one of the 10 key themes, emerging themes, and yet we hear very little other than when we get the statistics. One in, Hannes mentioned 1 billion people will have a form of disability by 2050. The same is going to be true for older persons. And we tend to think of aging as occurring in the more developed countries, which is not true. By 2050, 1 in 5 will be living in Asia, with double the steep growth in Africa. So what should guide our understanding of the importance and accessibility of public space for older persons? We know that we have to be concerned about safety. Is there poor lighting? Are there no flat paths? If you look at that first picture, this is what Hannes was describing as accessible design. You see that there's a ramp so that if you're pushing a baby carriage, if you're in a wheelchair, or if you're 22 and you're on crutches because you had a skiing accident, you're not required to go up and down to access the public space using the stairs that you see on the left. Transportation, often we don't think about it. How easy is it to take public transportation to get to public spaces? Are they walkable? If they're not, how do you get there? Is the entrance accessible? Many of us have seen public space, as Hannes was saying, increasingly becoming privatized, and you see gates and you see keys that are required for those that can have access. What about comfort? Are there sufficient benches so that people can sit and relax and even chat with each other? Are there water fountains? Is there water available, especially on the hot days? Is there shade? Are the benches in areas where the sun is beating down on people, or are they designed carefully so that the two go together, shade and benches? What about clean, accessible bathrooms? So if you can go forward, Luisa, the next, I tried to give you a range. For those, as Hannes said, disability is not one dimension, they're multiple. So I have a couple of examples of very good public space design, in this case for people either with autism, or if you just want a quiet place in an internal residential area where you can read, where you can talk to and socialize with your neighbor. Next, Luisa, I have to go quickly because I don't have a lot of time. There is even a very interesting model recreated village in the Netherlands near Amsterdam, which is home to 150 men and women with severe dementia. And what they've done is recreated the kind of traditional community that used to exist when these people had their full mental faculties. And it offers a safe environment for them to feel free with, obviously, caregivers watching what's going on, but they can go shopping, they can get their hair done, they can go and sit in the community, all within a very safe space. Next, Luisa. The next example, if you can see, is a restorative garden, the Elizabeth and Nona Evans Restorative Garden in the Cleveland, Ohio, in the US Botanical Gardens. And this is specially designed. I met the woman who did the urban design. It's a space created specifically for those who are going through what they call horticultural therapy. It has winding pathways so that you feel that you can take a break. There's a nook in case you need to be away from some of the people, time out. You see this woman in a wheelchair touching plants. The plants are all very carefully designed so that they can be touched. There's a tactile connection. Special grass holds the weight of a wheelchair. And there's even Braille information on the railings, as well as seating for modular options. The next picture, Luisa. I mentioned the problem of accessibility to parks, so that many of them have gates. I'm here in New York City, and the Parks Department has initiated a Parks Without Borders initiative. And this is an example where you can see that the open space, while enclosed, is safe, but there's no fencing and no gate around it. And this is only one of many examples here in the 5 boroughs of New York. Next are 2 pictures of the kind of social mixing. And the first one is obviously in an Asian community. Well, they both are. And the second one shows the intergenerational aspects. More and more parks are using that kind of intergenerational space. And if I had time, I'd tell you about the wonderful architect, Robert Wong, I've gotten to know in Hong Kong, who worked with a nearby older residential space to have a collaborative design. And it was not he as an architect, but the residents who said, we absolutely need to have equipment and space for our grandchildren to play near where we are sitting. So they redesigned it, and now he's gotten multiple grants from his local government because it worked out so well. Next picture. I also want to remind us that we shouldn't only consider public spaces as outdoors. Here's an example of an excellent library located in Chester, Northwest England, that has flexible seating, audio loops, and accessible backstage changing rooms. So let's think broadly, not just about the outdoors. Finally, we need to think about how are we going to deal with encouraging older persons to return to public space after the scare of the virus. And 2 professors, Setha Lowe here in New York City and Anastasia Lucatur Sideras at UCLA in California, have noted the persistent fear of many older persons that might prevent them from going to public space and the critical need to become less isolated. And they offered several quick suggestions. Why not establish early morning hours for senior only at popular parks and beaches or designated areas of the park for their exclusive use? We now have that, at least in New York, with some of the important grocery stores and pharmacies, early hours for seniors only. We need benches safely spaced apart for socializing. They suggest perhaps allocating the first car of every tram, every subway train, and the front section near the driver of every bus for vulnerable populations. And now I will pass the baton to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Chiou, has, as Luisa said, done a remarkable job. She is not only just an epidemiologist and doctor, but what excites me, and I've done a case study, which I hope to release shortly, on her long career, because she epitomizes how one can encourage at every level of government, from the local to the national, in her case, in the whole country of Taiwan, and merge how you introduce healthy aging concepts, which is a World Health Organization initiative, with their other initiative of age-friendly cities and communities. Dr. Chiou, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine, and good day and good evening to everyone. Yes, and Katherine has mentioned those wonderful aspects regarding public spaces we can do to be age-friendly. However, for me, I'm a person working on health promotion, and those efforts lie in the jurisdiction of other departments. So it's very important to engage political leaders to work together and also to work with other departments. And I've been working on healthy city and healthy community projects for 20 years. So for population aging, I would like to implement the WHO's age-friendly city model in Taiwan. And 11 years ago, I attended the annual conference on healthy cities in Taiwan, and one mayor complained to me. She saw the other mayors were receiving the awards, but she did not. She complained that how come she did not have any chance to do a pilot project? Then I say, here's your opportunity. We have the second generation healthy city project, which is specific for older persons, for population aging. Would you like to try? And she expressed her interest. And I encouraged her to have a cross-department committee. And she planned for the committee meeting. And but then she found that there was some resistance from those departments. They didn't want, they did not know what's age-friendly city, and they worried that that would be something extra to their heavy daily workload. So she invited me to sit in the first meeting, and I encouraged them to express their concern. And for public space, the colleagues said, first, it might be very difficult. Second, where is the budget? And third, they say we have to meet everybody's expectation, not only the older persons or persons with disability. Would that be very upsetting to the other very healthy persons? So number one, is it difficult? So I show them WHO's checklist, and I also show them those very beautiful pictures of universal design that actually public space with age-friendly design and universal design can be very innovative, very attractive, and not difficult. So there is a checklist and a model to follow. And second, about the budget, it's not about to have extra budget. It's about how to make the best use of your existing budget. Every city has the annual budget for new constructions, for new buildings, etc. You only have to include age-friendly design and universal design in your call for proposals, to include them into the scoring items of your bidding. And for those existing problems, you can use the savings from the bidding to do improvement one by one. Okay, and also, of course, the project should meet people's expectations. So I also tell them, as what Hannah and Katherine said, it's for everyone, easier and friendlier for everyone, not only for older persons. And actually, we also have to look at older persons' perspective. So we do needs assessment, and our older persons told us what are the top items to improve. Number one is the unevenness of the walkway. Second is about the bus stop. They would like bus stop to have the shelter and the bench to sit down. And third is about restaurants. Although it's not owned by the government, but it's the place for family time. They also would like to have age-friendly restaurants. So those are the priority areas we can work upon. And after they work upon those items, they received a very high, very positive response from their people. So we have the success in the first city, and then we have the other counties and cities to also attend Very soon we have all the 22 cities and counties in Taiwan doing age-friendly city project, and all of the mayors are very happy because they make their older persons and their families happy. So I think public space is very important for health, and we have the major stakeholders to engage: the political leaders, the department leaders, and also our users. And by using the right approach, we can get the whole of government and whole of society participation and satisfaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very passionate description of all the challenges and difficulties that are related to implementation of good principles related to universal design, because it's not just something that we want to see at the theoretical level, but mostly we want to see on the ground. We want to implement those ideas and very good principles into some policies at the local level. So we try to push political leaders and city managers to incorporate all those principles related to universal design into their policies, and to practitioners also to understand why universal accessibility matters. So now we move to Brazil, and we move to Nelson Saule. He's a lawyer and urban law professor of the postgraduate program in law from University Catholic of São Paulo. And he's also coordinator of the Right to the City area in Polis Institute of Studies, Training and Assistance in Social Policies. On behalf of Polis Institute, Nelson is member of the coordination of the Global Platform for the Right to the City. And so I'm very interested to know your opinion as a lawyer regarding this concept of the right to the city.
Yes, thank you, Luisa, for inviting me to join on this webinar about public space. For us, the global platform, the right to the city, it's a pleasure not to be here with you and the colleagues and the audience. So the right to the city is exactly in a perspective we bring the last 20 years from the different networks and social movements to bring the perspective, the human rights in the cities. Is exactly not only the perspective, the philosophy, but also for the obligations, responsibilities for the governments, for the states, for the authorities. This will bring also the perspective to recognition of the right to the city in the legal institutional perspective. In Brazil, we have, the right to the city is recognized like a legal rights, fundamental rights, one national law, state of the city. We have this law during the last 20 years. And also the global platform bring this perspective for the international level. We enjoy the Habitat 3 process since the beginning for the one recognition, the right to the city, La Vision, for the new urban agenda. In some way, we got this vision, the right to the city in the new urban agenda in paragraph 12 and 13. So the vision we have about the right to the city, the connection with the public space. For us, the right to the city is the right of our inhabitants, present and future inhabitants, permanent and temporary, to use, occupy, produce, enjoy just, inclusive, and sustainable cities, villages, and human sentiments, defined as a common good. This vision, the common good, is one important issue in the vision, the right to the city, because you are bring the perspective, the other vision, the city, no the vision, the economy only for the use of the city, no for the competitive vision of the city, even this more focus in the technology like smart city, but to bring one perspective for the inhabitants, no, the city should be one space for our inhabitants. It is the perspective the city is a common good. We bring the components, the right to the city. One component, the right to the city, is exactly the quality of public spaces. No, we have the other components, especially the enhanced political participation, no discrimination, city without any kind of discrimination, gender equality, cultural diversity, inclusive citizenship, and also the social function of the city. So about the public space, I want to raise it. First of all, what is the finality? What is the strategy for us to raise the public space? Because we believe the public space is one strategic space we need to have in the cities for the qualify and enhance the citizenship and the democracy in the cities. And the public space, we work in some dimensions, the political dimensions, economic dimensions, cultural and the social dimension. The political, we believe the public space has an important role in the cities we have a society and with more qualification in to consolidate the democracy in the cities, for we have a society with more diversity. It also is one important strategy for political dimension, the education using the public space. I think we have these moments, important moments in the world, with these protests, demonstrations, the voices regarding against the racism on the streets, especially in the United States, because of the crime against George Floyd, but are raising in many cities, many countries, the voices and protests against the racism using exactly the public space, our streets or parks or squares, for raise your voice and your messages. Also for democracy, in Brazil especially, we have a one critical moment, in many situations, the health, the pandemic here is worse. I think you know the news about Brazil. The president don't take any responsibility about to combat, the pandemic, the COVID-19, and also the political situation here. Is very critical. And then the public space in this moment also is very important, for exactly for the society, even happening this pandemic, to use the same ways the public space for protests, for manifestation, to defend the democracy in Brazil. So this one perspective, the democracy and participation in the public space. Also we have other important example for the public space regarding the political dimension is the increasing the policies about the urban mobility using systems more sustainable, like a bicycle. In many cities, in many countries, we have strong movements for to implement these policies, usually using exactly the public spaces for sustainable and also to some way to contribute for the impact of the climate change using urban mobility sustainable. The other dimension, we work in the perspective of the right to the city. There is a connection with the public space and the economy. I think we know, the informal economy is majority in the urban areas in the cities. Is actually the streets, the public space or space for you have these activities, the informal workers, for food, pickers of trash, the artistic using the streets, the different kind of works are in the formal ways are using the public space. And that is very important to arrange, the dimension, the economy, it connects with the right to the city and the public space is special to protect, the rights of these informal workers using these spaces. Also, now are one dimension in the economy perspective to recuperate spaces for the agricultural perspective, connect with the food security, are movements, to using public areas, for the perspective to agricultural activities, in the cities. This is an important dimension, for the economic and public space. In the other dimension, we work, you are raised is important. It's about the cultural and the artistic expressions, for using the public space, in special when we are having the perspective for using the public space for expression, artistic like music, dance, especially for young people using the streets, for your culturals in the neighborhoods, and this is very important for the dimension of the culture. Also using services, Kathleen raised the library, the schools. I think this is important. We take in account. It's very important. We could to understand these equipments, the services, the education, culture are in public spaces also. It's important to enhance, to use for the communities these spaces, for education, for pedagogic perspective, for citizenship, and for the perspective also the human rights. For this is very important, the democracy, the participation, the inhabitants, in this process. I agree with the colleague, Shu, are raising the participation in the process to define the priorities in the budgets. I think in Brazil we have some experience for we call participatory budgets for defining priorities in the neighborhoods in some cities. And for planning also, also is very important, the participation of the communities and citizenship. Also in the micro perspective, we need to have the participation for management of these public spaces, like councils for parties, council for using these spaces with the representative members of the communities, the organizations from civil society, to guarantee the diversity, for don't have any kind of the discrimination for using these spaces when sometimes we have, regarding issues, the race, ethnic issues, or regional issues, or social issues, or political. So this is some
sorry, yes,
points I want to raise. I
yeah.
exactly close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelson. Actually, it's not just the social dimension of public space, but as you pointed out, is also the political, economic, and you know, democracy and rights at the different levels. I mean, civil rights for anyone to be part of public spaces, enjoy them, live them, and find opportunities for exchange, interaction, solidarity, cooperation, expression, everything that is related to us as human beings. This is really very important. Thank you, Nelson. So now we move to another perspective, I would say, from academic research perspective. So we move from Brazil to Australia. Now we have a presentation from Silvia Tavares and Nicholas Stevens. They are both from the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. Silvia is an urban designer with a background in architecture, urbanism, and building and city science. She was a guest editor of the current issue that you can find on the homepage of the Journal of Public Space on public health and well-being in public open spaces through climate responsive urban planning and design. Nicholas Stevens is a landscape architect and town planner with a background in spatial planning and urban design. He's the undergraduate and postgraduate program coordinator of urban design and town planning at the University of Sunshine Coast and the deputy director at University of Sunshine Coast Center for Human Factors and Socio-Technical Systems. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, well, I would like to first of all thank you, Luisa and Hendrik, for having us, and it's an honor to be part of this initiative and this panel. I'll share this presentation with Nick Stevens, my colleague, and we'll present a project we have been working on, which is about some ways of embedding safety into cities through the design of resilient public spaces. So throughout these challenging times with the lockdown of COVID-19, we have been questioning what can we learn from these changes in the dynamics of public spaces? What are the implications for urban planning and design? And is it possible to design safer places? So if we have a new outbreak, maybe the public spaces could perform in a different way and offer more possibilities under those circumstances. But we also know that once we can, we will want to have our old lives back. So we want this return to our familiar routines, and our memories of the lockdown will slowly fade away. So there is a possibility as well that we won't see many changes. So there are different ways of seeing this at this stage that we are. There are, however, some situations when we can't go back. And what you are seeing on the screen is Christchurch in New Zealand. That was a situation where after a very big earthquake in 2011, there was a lot of disruption, and there wasn't really an option of going back. So there wasn't much left, and what was left wasn't safe. So Christchurch is an example of a traumatic and fast disaster where action was the only option. It is interesting to realize that COVID-19 has also been referred to as a fast disaster if compared to climate change. So as we can actually see the impact of it in our lives and in the public spaces where we live in. But thinking of climate change, what you see on the left, on the map on the left, is what came to be known as the red zone. So the red zone was an area that cannot be built anymore due to the changes in the soil and the risk for flood. Some land actually sank during the earthquake, and so it became even lower than the sea level. So the map on the right is the prediction for the 100-year flooding. which actually shows exactly the same area that then became the red zone. So what we can see is that 100-year prediction becoming reality in 10 seconds of earthquake. So when we think about the temporality of all these events, the earthquake is a really fast event. Climate change is a slow event, it's a slow disaster. And the COVID-19 sits in between in that regard. The issue or the challenge that we have is that the slower the disaster, the more chances we have to choose not to act. So what can we actually take for the future? What can we learn? Some lessons that Christchurch show us is that they had to be creative. They had to bring life back to the city. And so we saw a lot of pop-up areas that were meant to be safe. So safety became the priority. And then of course we can think, of course, safety was a priority. It was post-earthquake. It was a very disturbed environment. But what is interesting for us is that safety is also a priority now. And both disaster or both situations are directly related to density. So while in the earthquake, the buildings became a threat because another earthquake could happen, people also became, like a very crowded place could be an issue. Like we were always getting into places trying to look for the exit. What if something happens? How do we move? What is this mobility and our capacity to exist? And in the pandemic, also the density of people and a lot of people in the same place does become an issue. So we are looking at what happened in that period of the earthquake, and especially in the recovery phase, not specifically just after the earthquake where there was all that disruption, but when it started to be rebuilt. And we are doing that based on 2 questions. If we prioritize safety in the design of public space as in Christchurch, would it be possible to have spaces that better perform in the event of a new disease outbreak? And are there any dimensions of public spaces that need to be considered so these spaces do this better performance when needed? Now I'll pass on to Nick. Nick is going to explain how we are doing this study.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia, and hello, everyone. So look, we're exploring these complex inquiries using a systems approach. Now, to use a systems approach is not new. You know, the city as machine, Le Corbusier, the city as organism, a biological view. But here we're drawing on the scientific legacy of human factors and ergonomics discipline, and in particular, this idea of socio-technical systems. So that's humans' interactions with their environments. And such approaches are often already used in the design of safety critical complex systems. So think about things like road transport and aviation, defense and security, command and control, healthcare. And if perhaps we view urban development, indeed public space, as a safety critical system, we can better explore their capacity to be resilient in the face of disaster. So the approach is really defined by the ideas that safety is impacted by the decisions and actions of every human and non-human element within that system, that events and outcomes are caused by multiple interacting contributory factors. The effective countermeasures focus on systemic changes rather than individual components. And so taking this perspective, we've been exploring the implications of the COVID lockdown and also using the systems approach to learn from the fast disasters such as the Christchurch earthquake. So next slide, please. So the approach we've used is a work domain analysis. Now it looks rather complex, but in fact it's a simplification of a complex process, and it's well established in human factors. And what it does is it describes a system across 5 levels, from the overall purpose, the aspirations of the system at the very top, to the way in which you measure the progress towards that, the activities or the function the system needs to perform in the middle, and then the processes and resources available. So what it is, it's a simple but not simplistic representation of complexity. It's inclusive of all system elements and their interdependencies, which is unique. It's also formative in nature, so it describes what could happen rather than what should happen. And importantly, the idea of means-ends relationship. So really what, why, and how are significant. So you can see at the bottom, at the very bottom there in that red, and you're not expected to read it, but in 2015, for a project for the Seven Senses Foundation, we developed a systems model of university accessible public space. So we're calling that a pre-COVID model. And in our recent work, we've been able to overlay the implications of COVID lockdown on that model. And in particular, what activities or functions in the public space have ceased to exist. So what were the implications on the overall system's performance? And it revealed, 15 of the 24 critical functions of public space ceased under lockdown. So for example, the provision of places to meet, public amenities, social interaction, of course, were no longer available. And unsurprisingly, these were shown to impact kind of individual and community and health and well-being at the very top. Next slide, please. So importantly, when we've also been considering the learnings from the FAST disasters, we begin to see or to consider public safety as a safety critical domain. There are really some key functions that were lacking in that pre-COVID model that we would consider are important for the development of resilient public space going forward. So they included things like retreat and individual spaces, spaces where the main activity is based on people alone or in small groups. Environmental comfort. So considering those spaces, then the visual, thermal, the acoustic and the ergonomic comfort associated with those sorts of spaces. People's protection from adjacent built forms, so not at risk from infrastructure or adjacent buildings. Optimizing the ability to leave, so having numerous ways of exiting or entering public space are critical. And importantly also maximizing the use of soft landscape, so landscape that frames the movement of the space, that permits users access to nature and greenery as well. So next slide, please. So look, the research that we've been doing is exploratory. It's been terrific that we had a pre-COVID public space model to work from, but the indications are that that model and the safety critical perspective are in fact useful and do provide new insights for building resilience in public space. They allow us to explore the complex interactions in urban systems, and even that systems of systems viewpoint. We begin to interrogate cities and public spaces for what we know that they already are. They're complex settings, which are certainly more than the sum of their parts. And we need these insights now before we begin to slip back into the business as usual approach to the delivery of our public spaces. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these very critical and complex analysis on public spaces from a research perspective, which is actually very useful also to inform design activities. We move now to, sorry, I'm quick because I see that we have a bit delay in what we have previously scheduled. So now I'm moving fast to the next speaker from Lebanon, Wael Sinno. He's an architect, graduated from the Lebanese American University in Beirut and Byblos. And he's now area coordinator for Beirut and Mount Lebanon at the UN Habitat Lebanon. And so his work is related to plan, manage and develop humanitarian projects related to civil society and local authorities, empowerment, urban analysis, community-led neighborhood upgrading projects and public spaces. Thank you, Wael, for joining.
Thank you, Luisa and Hendrik, for organizing this webinar, and for the speakers for the great presentations. I will share my screen. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to present today is a bit different. I'm going to talk about the response of UN Habitat Lebanon regarding COVID-19 pandemic. So first I'll start with a brief introduction, then talk about the rapid field assessment, then the ongoing project, which is the provision of hand washing stations, and then the completed one, which is the distribution of hygiene kits. So Lebanon is a highly urbanized country. 90% urban by population, 65% of its inhabitants living in 5 main urban agglomerations: Beirut, Saida, Tripoli, and Tyre and Zahle. To date, UN Habitat's national response operates based on a number of national directives, guidelines, and documents. So as I said earlier, UN Habitat Lebanon undertook a rapid field assessment in April 2020 for the local authority capacities across the country. So there were 4 main objectives, which are: 1, identify current response undertaking by local authorities, define gaps and propose solutions through projects and fundraising. 2, understand how to better support local authorities and communities as frontline responders. 3, contribute to a broader coordinated response and by sharing findings with all concerned actors. And 4, identify key urban challenges relating to the response and propose mitigation measures in the most vulnerable locations. So as a first step, we developed a checklist based on the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities circular. And this checklist mainly covered the measures that were undertaken by the Union of Municipalities to contain COVID-19, the possibility of establishing coordination platforms, who are the main actors who are actually responding to the virus, the intention of local authorities to establish isolation centers, assessment for the cleanliness of the water resources, urgent livelihood needs, and other emergencies like, for example, hygiene equipment, capacity building trainings for the communities. So there were 4 steps in the methodology. First, we had to identify and select the Union of Municipalities. It was mainly based on the size of the municipality and its exposure to the COVID-19. The second step was to train 4 groups of field team composed each of 3 persons, 1 from technical and 2 from social backgrounds. 3, to conduct the interviews with the head of unions and municipalities. And 4, to identify the immediate, medium, and long-term needs. So mainly the rapid assessment was conducted with 34 union of municipalities and 5 individual municipalities covering 8 governorates. These are some photos from the meetings, and here on the field we're actually taking photos of potential isolation centers. So as preliminary findings, I will just list the most important ones. The Union of Municipalities and Municipalities were fully engaged in the COVID-19 response despite the limited resources. At the level of the governorate, there were a crisis cell to actually follow up on the implementation of the lockdown rules and the monitoring of the COVID-19 cases. At the level of the municipality, there was an emergency committee, which was in coordination with the disaster and risk management team, volunteers, and local community. They were constantly doing the precautionary measures that are mainly sterilizing the open public spaces, distribution of masks and gloves, and fixing checkpoints on the main entry of the villages to monitor the body temperature and to disinfect any product that is actually accessing the village. Other findings are mainly that municipalities were obliged to actually help those who are suffering, mainly with food assistance. The identification of isolation centers was not based on clear guidance or procedure. There wasn't always clean water for all the households. Wastewater, solid waste is actually also not properly managed, but there were always raising awareness on COVID-19 for the community. So as immediate needs, at the technical level, there was a high need for protection supplies and materials when it comes to gloves, masks, and disinfection materials, because it was very costly for the municipality. There were some isolation centers that were required rehabilitation and equipment. At the level of water, there was a dire need to supply and install hand washing stations, mainly in localities where vulnerable population groups are settled. This will help to avoid the spread of the COVID-19 again in the area. And at the solid waste level, there was a need for technical capacity of the municipality on how to treat the medical waste and disposal of gloves. At the social level, municipalities requested financial support to implement COVID-19 related income generating activities. Also similar thing, they required also food assistance for the communities because of the deteriorated socioeconomic status of the residents, and also awareness and capacity building for the residents. So when it comes to medium and long-term needs, it was mainly on 4 sectors: urban basic services, wastewater, solid waste management and disposal, and affordable housing and shelter. So mainly we put all these priorities per governorate, because we work with the 8 mainly. And then we produced this matrix showing a detailed need per union of municipality. And now we gathered all these info, figures, findings, and recommendations and compiled them in one report, which is now published on UN Habitat Lebanon website in case you're interested to check it out. Moving forward, based on the assessment, UN Habitat Lebanon intervened in 2 actions. So the first one was to enhance the hygiene and awareness practices by the provision of hand washing stations. 22 stations will be located in the public spaces of the most crowded neighborhoods in Beirut and Burj Hamoud, mainly next to the markets, entrances of the neighborhoods, next to religious facilities where there always be crowded areas, where the municipality will be responsible for the maintenance and operation of this product in coordination with the local community, mainly cleaning, water supply. In fact, these stations will contain soap, tissue, and a bin, and people will have the opportunity to wash their hands before and after entering the shops or the neighborhood to reduce the risk of COVID-19. In addition, awareness raising on the importance of hand washing station will be delivered to the communities, and capacity building trainings on operating and maintaining this product will be implemented for municipal staff and shop owners. This is a photo of the hand washing station. It's easy to use. You press by foot on the red step for soap supply and on the gray step for water supply, and you take tissue from here and you throw it in the bin. These are photos of the context of the neighborhood we're working in. This is a Palestinian gathering in Beirut. And also these are photos of the coordination with the local authority and the local community regarding the identification of the most strategic location of the hand washing stations. This is a draft map of the locations. We'll add also landmarks for better referral. Moving to the completed, I know I run out of time. This is the last project which is completed. It's mainly that we distributed 992 hygiene kits targeting 4,415 persons. And this was done in the most vulnerable neighborhood in Beirut called Sabra. This intervention was done in close collaboration with a local NGO called PARD and existing local communities, so we can cover the poorest channels in the area. This includes also door-to-door awareness on the usage of the kits and hygiene behavior. These are communication and awareness raising materials that we produced: sticker, pamphlet, roll-up, and SGBV poster. We gave vouchers through the door-to-door modality, and actually the community came to the center to grab the hygiene kit. This is it, by the way, and this is the context of the neighborhood we're working in. And these are the families getting their hygiene kits from the center. I'm done here, thank you. If Hendrik can present the video, please. This is for the distribution of hygiene kits.
Hendrik, I can't hear. Maybe you should put your sound on. Hendrik, you should probably unmute yourself.
Now the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions.
Okay, wait. I'm not mute. No. Can you hear the video? I'm not muted.
The video suddenly stopped. I think it's a connection.
Yes, we can hear you. So maybe you can restart the video.
استوجب انتشار فيروس كورونا المستجد كوفيد-19 اتخاذ تدابير احترازية قد يصعب تطبيقها ضمن المجتمعات المهمشة، حيث يتعذر توفير الموارد اللازمة. Since last year, Lebanon has been experiencing crisis after crisis, starting with the civil uprising in October 2019,
followed by the current and ongoing socioeconomic crisis, and now the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions.
قام برنامج الأمم المتحدة للمستوطنات البشرية UN Habitat استناداً إلى بيانات ملفات الأحياء الحضرية بتحديد عدد من الأحياء المهمشة في صبرا، من ضمنها شارع الجزار والتجمع الدعوك وسعيد غواش وحي الباشا، إضافة إلى مباني غزة وسلوى الحوت. نحن عم نوزع حصص نظافة في بقلبها مستند بيساعدكم لحتى تعرفوا كيف بنغسل إيدينا وأي متى بنغسل إيدينا وكيف بنعقم. فبالتعاون مع جمعية المساعدات الشعبية للإغاثة والتنمية بارد، وفر البرنامج حوالي 1000 حصة تشمل الاحتياجات الأساسية للنظافة الفردية وتتضمن مواد تنظيف وتعقيم وحماية شخصية.
كانت مساعدة كتير حلوة منكم، وأهل المنطقة طبعاً كتير استفادوا من أدوات التنظيف لأنها كتير مهمة لهم، خاصة بالوضع اللي نحن فيه، وضع كورونا، وكتير شكراً على هالمبادرة الحلوة.
ستتيح هذه الحصص لقرابة 4500 شخص اتخاذ تدابير الوقاية والنظافة المناسبة لمدة شهرين.
Thank you, Hendrik.
Thank you, Wael, for this very interesting presentation regarding the complexity of putting in place, measures and activities to support and help fragile and vulnerable communities. We understand the effort is big and very challenging because this is an unprecedented situation, and it is important also to ensure safety in public space regarding also the contagion. And so I think this is very relevant to explain how sometimes, talking about public space is part of a very big, difficult discussion, which is related to many other systems and infrastructures and complexities. Okay, so now we have we closed the presentations from the speakers, and we welcome our commentator for today, Alessandro Melis. Alessandro is a professor of architecture innovation at the Portsmouth School of Architecture, and he is well known in Italy, I would say, because he was appointed as a curator of the Italian pavilion at the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale that was recently postponed to 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Alessandro has a background both at the professional and academic level with strong record of publication and achievements at the international level. I invited him today to join this webinar because the Italian pavilion that is curating at the Venice Architecture Biennale is on resilient communities. And so we have been discussing for quite a year now regarding what resilient communities means and why resilient community matters. And so I think that during this pandemic, we finally understood. And now probably we have some of the answers we were looking for before. But now the floor is yours, and thank you for joining.
Well, thank you very much, Luisa, for this presentation. Thank you also, Hendrik, for inviting me. I think that is, as you said, since we have this postponing of the Italian pavilion, for me it was a great opportunity to be here now because, well, I have a bunch of notes that I will use for my project. And I would say that probably the best thing is that one of the backbone of our pavilion, our project, and Luisa knows because he's part of the team, is the transdisciplinarity of the approach. And today I have, I can say, an evidence of the fact that transdisciplinary approach is, let's say, pivotal for the for understanding resilience and applying resilience to communities. So thank you very much, because more than a commentary, I'm here like a young student trying to learn different researches and trying to understand how to make them useful also for myself in an egoistic way. So just very quickly, I would say that I have a few notes that I would like to share with you, more like a discussion. I don't know if it's helpful for the round table, that were very helpful for me to understand the perspective. So an aspect that for me was very important to be stressed, especially by the first two presentations, was that diversity here, inclusivity here is not intended only as an idealistic term of social justice, but also as a opportunity, an opportunity of resilience. So the more we consider inclusivity and diversity, the more we have resilient environment, especially in the public space. This is important because also Shu highlighted very well how important is the use of communication with decision makers. So we always have to stress, I perfectly understand what Katherine and Shu said, because this is exactly my work, how important is not to tell them how beautiful is diversity to build a more just environment for a philosophical reason, but to tell decision makers that this is convenient. It's convenient because it makes the space more usable, make the space stronger, makes the space also, as been stressed by many of our guests, that it's also economically convenient. We just have to turn economy in a different, let's say, interpret economy in a different way. So the second aspect that for me is important, coming from the field of urban ecologies, is that all what you have said are ecology is relevant. You never nominate this word, but for me, this is the main outcome. So we are always talking about how to adjust the public space, considering this as the place of an ecosystem, where there is not what we call classical Oxley chessboard. So we are not players making a game against each other. We are part of an ecosystem. The more this ecosystem is balanced, the more this ecosystem is resilient. Of course, because it seems that from all the presentation, community resilience is highly important. So coming back to the first presentation, Hannes was being very precise in telling us that, well, if I can translate this in a very simple way, minority doesn't exist. Many minorities make a majority in this case. So when I hear the numbers, this is, of course, this is part of the annotation, and we are talking about 80% of disability and diversity in developing countries. It seems that also the discussion of diversity and what is the mainstream is more theoretical. So we are just, our world is made by just, how can I say, an integration, not addition, rightly our guest said, of diversities. So the only problem is that sometimes one of these diversity becomes somehow dominant in an economic and a political way, but there is not such a thing in the real world. So, and I would say that it's very important how Hannes has highlighted, has universal design approach can become really a trigger to make our place not only more inclusive, but also more attractive, better place. And I like very much the definition that you used, that the public space is key in this context, because it's the critical link in mobility chain. So it is clear that this is the place, this is the engine of the city, this is the place where universal design must start from. And I also like very much the explanation how very pragmatic for a professional architect, not only for the researcher, to explain that also in this case, integration in design is highly important, and how if we think strategically to the construction of public space in a universal sense, we will have advantages in terms of economic approach. So I would say that, of course, the relationship with the World Blind Union was a perfect link, I would say, to the link to the presentation of Katherine about aging population and elderly, where, of course, immediately lead to an extension of what was said before. Diversity is just an integration of different perspectives and a vehicle to an intergenerational perspective in the case of elderly people. I like very much that this could be the this perspective of the public space of, let's say, a meeting point of intergenerational perspective. I find this a fantastic definition. And I would like to say also in this case that for me, many things that Katherine was mentioning were part of what we call ecology. So how the transportation, the water management, the water systems, the shade, the multidimensional, the multiscalar elements, components of the public space join and make a space, a well-balanced space, like an ecosystem, really. And also I find it interesting for me because this is a discussion that is very important, very relevant in Italy today, especially for the Italian pavilion, is exactly what Katherine said. So we always, when we think of public space, we always think about the open space. Well, the case of the Italian pavilion demonstrates that this is not. It is, how much I have left? 2 minutes?
2 minutes. Yes, I think yes, you have 2 minutes.
I will go very fast. So I would say that for me, it's very relevant what, as I said before, Shu said about communication with decision makers. No impact without the capability of communication. As a researcher, we have to learn that we have studied everything, we know everything, but we are totally incapable to communicate this to decision makers. This is a key element. Of course, the presentation from by Nelson was key also from my perspective because he highlighted what we think is very important, and this is also highly discussed in Italy. Sorry if I make this example. So the right to the city, it's really an element that is important, and I would like to extract from this presentation a couple of aspects like the importance of education, education in the public space, and the approach to informality as a means of sustainability. This is something that, as probably Luisa knows, is I consider it very close to me because temporary appropriation of public space, especially in South America, is a key stream of research that I consider very important. So thank you, Nelson, for this presentation. Sylvia and Nick have been talking about something also very important, very timely. So the relationship between the crisis in the longer term and the crisis in the short term. I totally agree with this approach because the problem we are having now is that many times we don't link these two elements and we treat symptoms like the COVID as something that we have to address in immediate time, while we have to consider very carefully what is the big picture, which is okay from my perspective, is clearly environmental, and COVID is a symptom because this time we have COVID, next time we could have dengue fever, next time we could have West Nile virus, we could have an hurricane. So we have to approach this with a methodology. Well, I would say to tell a lot about this, Nick and Laura, Sylvia, sorry, because I don't know if you are aware of this, maybe not, but I was the director of the Studio Christchurch for the University of Auckland. So I've been working a lot on this project. I worked in the southern green belt of Christchurch on the project of reconstruction. So the photograph, I participated to some of these photographs, especially of the transitional city, of the occupation of public space. So I would like to share more discussion with you guys about this. While I think that it's also the presentation for me was very interesting for a series of points. I can pick only one up as the time is a tyrant, as we say. And I would say that is very relevant for my current research. Sorry to be so egoistic. Exactly what you said. So how the problem of public space can be linked to a lack of infrastructure in crisis conditions. So it's very interesting how your research, especially the water supply, how the public space can become really the place where, in case of lack of infrastructure, we can start from to deploy infrastructural system to start making the community come together. So where the lack of infrastructure is higher, we already know that the public space become pivotal. And of course, also in this case, especially in the case like Lebanon for me is also very relevant. I'm working in Syria and in Jordan for other researches, and so I find this very close to my to my heart to try to understand how also informal activities, temporary appropriation activities can become, in a way, tools to make public space more sustainable in the transitional period, in the extreme crisis period. And when we talk about crisis, of course, here I would not only mention climate change or earthquake, as we said before. We are talking also about wars. So thank you very much for this enriching opportunity to learn from you guys. I hope to have more opportunities. As you can imagine, this is just a small amount of information that I'm collecting here, and I hope to be in touch with you. Thank you very much again to Luisa and Hendrik for this opportunity.
Thank you, Alessandro. I know we just gave you 10 minutes. I know it's difficult to make a commentary after these very insightful presentations. We are supposed now to have a roundtable discussion, but the time is almost over. Well, actually it's over, yeah, already. But before closing this webinar, I would like to have a very quick round of comments, because I would like you to say something regarding the main question that I see many are posing on the internet, and there are many articles now published regarding the public space and future of public space. I would point out to one article that was published just a few days ago on Thomson Reuters Foundation. I can share the article on to the chat with all attendees and speakers. This article says that public space is a lifeline for post-lockdown cities. I find this very interesting because, as we said in a previous webinar, this pandemic has accelerated some of the processes that were already in place. I mean, many organizations, as we saw today, are advocating for better cities and better public spaces from multiple perspectives, and talking about rights, opportunities for all, create age-friendly cities, support vulnerable groups, understand the potential and unlock the potential of public space from multiple perspectives: political, economic, social, artistic, and more. So the question for you all is, do you really think that, as this article is pointing out, public space is a lifeline for post-lockdown cities? Who wants to answer? I'm sharing the article here in the chat for all the participants. If
Luisa, I will answer it just by reminding people of the concern of the two professors of how do we ensure, and I don't think it's just older persons, against the fear of being back out in public space when none of us really know when this virus is going to be contained. On the other hand, we also, all of us have said how absolutely critical public space is to democracy, to reducing isolation. And I just wanted to add one very brief example to what Alessandro said, which was reading about the post-crisis in Japan, where a city was leveled from a natural disaster. And it turned out it was the older persons who created a community center, and they did the cooking and brought the community back together and back to life. So there are so many such examples that I hope we can not only dwell on what the fears are and concerns, but what some of the positive actions are.
Anyone else? I know it's a very difficult question.
Very difficult. Yeah, but I think it's an opportunity that we look at the value and the importance of public space after the lockdown, that we realize how important it is and how much we would like to come back. And it's not only infectious disease we have to deal with. We also have to deal with non-communicable disease, deal with mental health and social health. I think we need to rebalance the risk and all those values and benefits we can get from the responsible use of public space. And while the outbreak is still here, or the fear is still here, one negotiating way would be to include some management or some improvement on sanitation and equipment for hand washing, etc., into public space, so that people can counteract their fear, but still have the chance to get together. I agree very much with you, Luisa, that public space is where we meet, we join, and we enjoy the city. Yeah. It's a lifeline.
Yeah, and if I may add very short to that, it's a very complex question, but from my perspective, or from the disability perspective in this discussion, I think that the COVID-19 crisis has shown, well, we all know it's shown that many of our systems were not prepared sufficiently, and many of their communities are struggling to really cope with the pandemic. But from my perspective, regarding accessibility, also in public space, but also generally, it has shown that, for example, the need to really keep social distance has proven difficult in many communities because many pedestrian areas are blocked for temporary or permanent reasons, or because of bad planning. Or just take the example of how many times you find it challenging to keep social distance on a sidewalk when there are bikes just over the place, or they have temporary containers, etc., which has proven difficult for many to really keep social distancing. So that has also hindered the accessibility in these very troubling times. So that is also an expression, and I think that has broadened the understanding of keeping like some areas safe and clean, for example, improve. And it's all about breaking barriers. And I think also this pandemic has showed us that access to information, also information which is available in different types of public space, is not available to everyone in a format which is accessible to everyone. Maybe older persons, children, persons with disabilities, etc., depending on where they live. So I think that is also a barrier, because public spaces is also critical when it comes to sharing information in different formats to the diversity of population. So I think that will be key questions to consider in building back better as well. Yeah.
Yes,
So
Nelson?
I just want to say, in case of Brazil, this is a critical point, because even during the pandemic, in the neighborhoods, periphery areas, the people continue to live in the work in the streets. This is the truth. It's another reality. Even with the pandemic, the people continue walking the streets, working the streets because it was necessary. Informal, more many things informal, and so he also many tensions for using public spaces. Special on the littoral, the coast, for using the beaches, the zone of for using the activities like surfing, many other things. Very tensions issues here, in Brazil, other sports, sportive activities, or I think is, in my opinion, the people go to value more than before they use the public space because they felt what's the important for your life, these spaces, in different dimensions. I think this could be one big issue for us in the cities post pandemic, because I think the field, the people is, we need this space, they are missing these spaces during this time.
Anyone else want to answer, say something? No, okay. Okay, fine. We can close this webinar today with this question mark, which is still, very difficult to answer. We understand as public space researchers, activists, and professionals at different levels that this is a challenge, actually. We cannot address public space in a simplistic way, I would say, because it's too complex, too broad, and too difficult to address. And so maybe public space will be a lifeline for post-lockdown cities, maybe not. It will depend from the opportunities of local governments and city managers, how they will understand the value and importance of public space and how they will be able to turn public space into an inclusive and accessible opportunity for all to live our cities again after the pandemic. Thank you to all the speakers for joining today. We are recording this webinar, and so we will post the video of this webinar on the YouTube channel of City Space Architecture. And as I said at the beginning of this webinar, we will also publish the summary of this webinar. So thank you again for all for participating. And now I give the floor to Hendrik Tieben, my colleague at the Chinese University of Hong Kong School of Architecture, for an announcement regarding the next webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Luisa, and of course all our panelists today. So I think it was a very exciting perspective from many different disciplines and locations. And also thanks for all our attendees. I just want to mention what we plan for next week, which will be a new topic, of course, related to COVID-19. As some of you might know, when you read basically this initiative of 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic, our idea was to have different layers of activities. So one are the webinars, and there will be a special issue of the Journal of Public Space. And other aspects are basically teaching initiatives, basically because many of us are involved in teaching. However, of course, everyone who's studying and teaching about cities, of course, usually goes out, right? Goes out, works with communities and different residents, and of course, try to absorb the kind of identity of different places. And I think it's a kind of key aspect of learning. Now, what do we do under the current condition? So basically, we have reserved one event to this topic. And in fact, over the last week, we organized already a workshop, basically reflecting the situation of us and also the students and so on, basically having to learn about the world from home. And basically, we will reflect about this. This was related to activities that we did together with Parsons New School in New York and with the University of Auckland and also the Journal of Public Space. So we will have different aspects, but also see there, I think this is on one hand interesting maybe for teachers, but also for other people. For example, how we study other places, for example, even as tourists for the tourist industry and so on. So Stephanie, who's also joining now, will talk about this. So I hope this will be interesting and also open another layer to our other webinars. And so I hope you stay tuned and you will find that interesting. So thank you very much for joining, and thank you all our panelists and our team, and see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.